Welcome back to old school / a little bit of inside the huddle, a Foreman Friends edition. We're brought to you by the Mercado Certified Piedmontese Special Ingredients and Butcher Shop and Advanced Medical Imaging, located at 7601 Pioneers Boulevard. But without further ado, we got a great friend and a future weekly friend of the program, hopefully. Mr. Greg Smith, National Recruiting Analyst, the man. I just call him the man because when you're out here, I will say this before we get into it, and I always say this every time that we do something. Me and Greg met at another place that we would probably rather not talk about, but then it was an instant connection, and we both kind of always been there and just shooting stuff off each other. For me, being a little bit older than Greg, or whatever, but to see how you just have gone through the process and to continue to grow and expand and dominate is I get more hype, for you than I know you excited, but I know I get more hype for you. So always congratulations. Always want to give props just because of number one, I appreciate the work you do, respect it, because it's good, honest work, and but without further ado, with the national recruiting analyst, and I will say this before that was obviously, diving in here in Nebraska. So I think it's really good, Greg, to have you on because I think you have the best of both worlds. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. You're here, you've seen different staffs, right? Right. We've seen the good.
Yeah, we've seen a lot.
And we can probably say Matt Rule's staff has really kind of actually, he calls it doing his job, but really exceeded expectations because he's more than delivered on their promises. But then also, I think also what, Ad, I want your opinion on this. Then you're able to take a better view maybe of Nebraska because now you're out nationally and you're seeing how other schools do it versus and then also seeing how other high schools and recruits are going in their process. Explain explain now the advantages of that because I think you have a very unique eye and perspective on recruiting in the state, but then also the great job that the staff is doing.
Yeah, first and foremost, thank you very much for the kind words, man. It's been a journey. We've been rocking together for a long time. So this kind of rise, I guess, through kind of the recruiting world has been an interesting one. Very, very thankful for the kind words, and I always appreciate people respecting the work. So thank you. It is, I think, a unique situation for me with my role in having gone through, like you said, seeing so many different staffs at Nebraska. And honestly, to be totally honest, when I started trying to go for this job, that came up. It came up that I had experience with different staffs, that I had experience with kind of Nebraska's rabid fan base, all of that stuff. And it's funny because you don't think that stuff will play into as you kind of progress in the experiences that you have and can bring to the table. But it really did help because I do have kind of a unique viewpoint. So then going from seeing kind of how these different staffs at Nebraska, the Huskers, but then also the high school coaches, and then being able to blend that to what I see nationally now, I think is really cool. When it comes to the comparison, first of all, I'll say about the high school coaches here in Nebraska, like I think that they're some of the easiest ones to work with that I'll find, right? Like they're reliable. They'll shoot you straight. They're honest about their guys, right? Whether or not, they're big time Power 5 kids or not, they'll definitely shoot you straight on that. You start to get out here in some of these other states, it gets a little dicey on whether or not, you'll be amazed. Probably not, though, at the amount of times that, a coach or a trainer is like, man, this kid, he needs to be, Ohio State needs to be looking at him. Notre Dame needs to be looking at him. And then you watch the film or you see him in a camp and it just doesn't match up. So, I say all that to say is that I think that people don't even realize how good they have it with kind of what's going on here in the state locally with high school football coaches specifically. And then when it comes to Matt Rule and his staff, it's really interesting because I talked to now a lot of different kids and a lot of different college staffs and kind of get the lay of the land to see how teams do it. And I think that Matt Rule and his staff do a great job, first and foremost, of building relationships with kids and their families. Like I've never run into anybody that doesn't respect what Rule and his staff kind of brings to the table and the way that they go about their business. That is not something that you could always say in previous years. So I think that that is something to definitely hang your hat on, and something that I think as Nebraska football continues to ascend, as we kind of think it's about to,
Right.
it's only going to help them even more, because once you have those wins or that on-field product to back it up, those relationships combined with that on the field product will be a real strong pitch.
You know, when you're traveling around the nation, and obviously keeping a keen eye on Nebraska, man. I think like eventually, I think Greg, you're gonna be like Windhorse. You know, he's with the NBA, and then he's based up there in the O, and you guys, that's gonna be you. I'm gonna see you popping up on there on a big bid network, but that's only a matter of time. I want to ask you, as when you've seen, I think it sometimes it goes in waves, but I think Nebraska's been on a hot streak. And I want to ask you this. Remember a few years ago, it started with Bellevue West, where you had the two tight ends and you had the running back that came to Nebraska, and then now it's shifted to West Side, and then obviously
Yeah.
this year, Millard South seems like at every position they have guys that are going to go to college either in 25 or 26. Talk about the progress that high school football has has come along, and I think it's like been in warp speed. Now it's
Yeah.
consistent, right? Where you're like, okay, yeah, you had a couple years of Bellevue West and a little dip down. Then you had some West Side kids, but now I think it's set up like year in and year out. You can always like project kids in ninth grade that are playing on varsity consistently throughout the whole state now.
Yep.
Of Power Five kids. Talk about how it's really, really grown, and the magnitude has grown, not only in the state, state lines, but then national level.
Yeah, what I think what you're seeing in Nebraska is the kind of the fruits of the labor of the movement to really do more specific training for football, right? And so you're always going to Nebraska's always going to be a state where you have kids that play multiple sports, and that's something that everybody loves, right? And that's good. But what they're also starting to do, or have been doing for the last handful of years, is get that specific football training at places like Warren Academy and a couple others. You're starting to see the fruits of the labor of 7-on-7 being in Nebraska, as well as you got a couple good programs doing 7-on-7 as well. So what you're seeing, especially at those skill positions, is you just see it kind of shooting up, right? As you see all these kids at skill positions all of a sudden coming out of Nebraska. And I think that, you mentioned a couple of the schools. Omaha Burke is another one that has produced numerous schools or numerous players. And then
Creighton
now
Prep,
Creighton Prep as well, especially with those linemen. But you're starting to see it really spread outside of just Omaha and Lincoln. It almost, in a way, kind of goes Omaha, kind of skips over Lincoln a little bit sometimes, and then goes out to central and western Nebraska. As you can always find guys out there now. It was a kid, Zybert, the tight end for Platteview, that just committed to Stanford after taking an official visit out there this past weekend. Like, you just weren't seeing stuff like that maybe 7-8 years ago. And so it's really cool to see that ascension. But I think that teams know that they can come to Nebraska and get a kid that is going to work hard, and that is not a finished product, right? It's not the same as like Texas kind of has a reputation for this as a state, right? Is that, yeah, there's a lot of really good players down there, but a lot of times you get those kids and they're kind of maxed out when you get them on your college campus. These Nebraska kids, if you've noticed, like Xavier Watts is a real good example of this at Notre Dame currently, and you've seen others that just continue to grow and get better and better as they get into college. And so that, I think those are some reasons where you're starting to see it. But Nebraska has definitely become a really good state for college football teams to come to. And you're starting to see it's not just teams in the region, right? It's teams. I just mentioned Stanford. You see Oregon coming in here all the time. There are teams from all over the country. Texas A&M now, with some of the connections that they have on their staff with Christian Ellsworth down there as an assistant. Like, they're coming up here now. Like, it's a really cool thing to see for the kids, because it now dangles that carrot a little bit. And that if you work hard, that, yeah, Nebraska will probably come to the table, but you're going to have all these different options out there from around the country.
And Greg, one thing I think that also the shift is, obviously, I think that, whether it's Steve Warren, Abdul Muhammad, they've done a really good job of exposing kids, no matter what their, family background is, to things outside of Nebraska, which then actually accentuates what they do here. also wanted to ask you about the recruiting process and how it's changed. Let's just say in the last, I'll say 12 to 18 months, and maybe even a little bit 3 years ago versus now. Talk
Yeah.
about the 2 year, I guess, process of the coaches and recruits to what the how they're going to, because like when I came out, it's like, hey, we couldn't transfer, but if we could, I was willing to wait 4 years and maybe do it at the end. And Ron
Mhm.
Paulus, I think it was, that, remember, he was the first one
Yeah.
that kind of did the graduate transfer. He went from Syracuse to Notre Dame and played quarterback. But talk about that, how kids are actually committing to a school. I mean, they're getting recruited for who knows 4 or 5 years, committing to a school, and it seems like they are in warp speed and need something on both ends within the
Mhm.
first 2 to 3 years, or they're like, all right, we're going to another place.
Yeah, I think it's honestly it comes from both sides on that, right? I think that it's the both the players are a little impatient on, hey, when I get here, it needs to be I need to be in the two deep right away. The amount of kids that I hear from around the country that believe they're going to go to school X and play right away, and it is all across the board. Kids from every state, everybody thinks that they're going to go in and play. Everybody thinks that their position group is a little soft on the team already, and they're just going to walk in and play. But then also on the flip side of that, every coach believes that they're just a couple players away from flipping that room. And so if that kid doesn't work out or really pop in the first couple of years, then they're just either going to recruit the next kid out of high school, or in this day and age, just go to the portal and try and basically get a little bit older kid that's already been in college to then take that spot. And so it is kind of that development piece of, hey, come into the program, take your time, get to know what's going on, build your body up, get used to college, and then we'll see you your, redshirt sophomore year or your junior year.
Right.
That is becoming few and far between out there. But the teams that can pull that off are actually having success, right? Like those teams have
Right.
actually played fairly well. But I also think that this goes back to something else that's a big trend in recruiting, which is these kids are being recruited so much earlier now, right? Like we talk
Right.
about, I feel like we've been talking about certain kids since they were like freshmen in high school. So if you go through that, your whole entire high school career being told you're the man and you can go to Nebraska or Iowa or Michigan or wherever, and then when you finally get there you don't play right away, yeah, of course you're going to be like, wait a second, I've been hearing I'm the man, why am I not playing? So there's a lot of factors that kind of go into that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that it's kind of ramped up, and I think a lot of these kids have the misconception that college is a pit stop to the pros, and high
Mhm.
school was just a foregone conclusion. Versus when you come here, you might think it's a little thin at a position, but some guys get healthy and guys switch into your
Right.
room. All of a sudden, up jumps the cat. You're looking over at some guys that actually move and play, and they're just as good as you, and are more mature and more
More,
physically
yeah, grown men in
developed.
some
Right.
cases, yeah.
You
Right.
know, I think the one school that used to make a living on that and was really, really consistent, and that sometimes in a 2 or 3 year period back in the, let's say, the old Big Ten was dominant, was Michigan State with
Yeah, that's exactly who I was
D'Antoni,
thinking about when you
right?
said that.
They,
Yeah.
they would get a guy in and say he was, and they would get a defensive lineman that might be, say, 225, put him in the weight room, and they would say it.
Mhm.
You see him by 3 years later, next thing you know, by his senior year, you got an all Big Ten second or maybe third or first all conference player. And that's how they were able to go and have that magical year, because they were trending towards that. Now, it's
Right.
hard to do that in this day and age. And I also wanted to ask you, as far as recruiting, and this is more of a recruiting and then a college culture thing. How do you differentiate the teams that are able to keep guys, I guess, in, let's say, invested, because they can have the eyes on the prize? That means they're willing to wait, let's say, 3 years, maybe 4 at the most, right? Depending on the situation, versus guys hanging around because they're too comfortable and like all the things that they get, that the benefits that don't have anything to do with football.
Right. Yeah, it's tough because you have to strike that balance as a program. So it's basically, trying to be like what you were saying with Michigan State. Iowa had done a good job of that. If you look at the most recent national champion, Michigan had done a
Right.
very
Yeah.
good job
Yeah.
of keeping those guys. And I think a lot of that it comes down to your culture, right? It comes down to whether or not you have a program that is all about the work, and that when guys, and I've talked to guys about this at other schools, like Wisconsin used to be like this too, where I would ask the Wisconsin guys at like Big Ten Media Days, like, hey man, like what's it like to be in like those weight rooms and to come into that culture, come into that program and know what's expected of you. And that's what they would say is that when I went on my official visit to Wisconsin, or I went on my official visit to Iowa, like there's no sugarcoating what this is going to be like. So it goes all the way back to how guys are being recruited, right? So it can't just be all flash and, here's what we're going to be able to do for you, go Texas style and have like Lamborghinis out in the lot
Right.
when you walk in and all of that. Like we need to actually demonstrate to you what this work is going to be like. And I think that setting that baseline of expectation, the same way you would do with like your kids at home, right?
Right.
Setting that baseline of expectations from the very beginning so that when you get to the school, it doesn't feel like a switch up, right? Like you're dealing with people honestly from the beginning. I think that really sets the tone for that whole thing. So you can avoid that situation where you guys got guys just hanging around because they're comfortable.
I also wanted to ask you. I know, it's kind of like if you take the United States and slice it in half and say the North and South. The South has and you see this in every sport, or just in two big sports, in football and baseball. Because of spring ball, and I'm referencing spring football.
Mm.
Talk about the difference between like the Southern schools and let's say the Northern schools, um, based on the type of football they're playing and the development, through their sophomore, junior, and senior years, based on having that extra. I don't know what would it be an extra, like they have a spring ball per se, really
Yeah.
realistically spring ball, and
Yep.
and how that affects recruiting. Is it a positive to have it? Do you get a better evaluation? Or I
Yeah.
think sometimes when you've been, let's just say, like the Rex Burkhead effect, right? Been the same player year in and year out. You can kind of, I wouldn't, Rex was a great player here, but I think like sometimes his greatness gets kind of glossed over, or how good he was glossed over, because you know what? It was rinse and repeat. He was going to
Yeah.
show up in big games. He's going to give you 1,000 yards. He's going to give you an honest day's work, but you won't get the 80-yard touchdown runs and stuff like that maybe somebody that could develop in later on in their career.
Yeah, I think it's a huge deal for those Southern schools, and it comes up in a couple ways, and it's funny this came up because this just came up the other day for me. So I was talking to we just made Tavian St. Clair, Ohio State's quarterback, commit for the 2025 class. We just made him a 5-star, right? And I was talking to his dad, and his dad said that the reason that Ohio State flat out told them the reason that they were slower to even offer him is because they didn't see enough of him in high school, because as compared to say California quarterbacks or kids down in Florida or even Texas have that spring ball, and they had more exposure to them as far as figuring out evaluation points, right?
Right.
And so if you're like, man, if a kid that eventually ends up being a 5-star needed to get that extra work so that Ohio State would be able to see him. Now, Ohio State's also in a very unique position because they can
Right.
go to kids like that and say that. Not
Yep.
every school can pull that off. Like I would
Right.
not recommend, everybody to do that. I would not tell, Iowa State to tell a kid that, but Ohio State can do it. But if that's the case for him, then it's the case for other kids, right? And so when you
Right.
see things around the country, like, Ohio in particular is a place that just started to allow their high school players to even play 7-on-7, right? Which is
Yeah.
actually kind of crazy given what happened. And what happened when they lifted that rule, you saw immediate floodgates open up of all those players going out to want to play 7-on-7. And then you also saw what? New scholarship offers for a bunch of those kids as well. So yes, I would say that it's a big benefit to be able to play in the spring settings in the 7-on-7. It is sometimes tough though, and like Ohio, a lot of those high schools still want them to have spring ball. I've actually talked to like the Ohio high school athletic association director or whatever.
Right.
He says there's no way that they're going to do that, and it's a weather thing. Like you can't just be out here playing spring football outside in Ohio. Yeah, like it might snow in the spring. Like you never know. And so yeah, it's a big deal because it's all about getting more exposure, to being able to get, also for teams to be able to see you, folks like me to be able to see what those kids can do as well, which is, it also ties into a different thing, which is why I always tell Midwest kids are also, because those Southern kids get earlier scholarship offers, right? Like
Right.
you will find, 20 class of 2027, class of 28 kids in the South that already have multiple scholarship offers. You don't see that as much in the North. Why? Because you're just not getting as much exposure and as much work out there as the Southern counterpart. So I tell those kids in the North, make sure you're going to these camps, right? Like some of these big camps, and not necessarily like you can do the team camps, that's fine for that one particular team. But like the Under Armour camp, our rivals camp, like stuff like that, like are actually really big deal for those Northern kids. There's a mega camp in Detroit that does a good, Wayne State that does a good job. Like all of that stuff is really important if you want to really get that early attention, because otherwise you'll see what you're seeing now, which is you'll notice that a lot of 2025, the current class offers are going out right now to these kids in Northern schools because they're doing what? They're out on the road getting seen by colleges.
Yeah, that was great. You answered my original question and the one that I was going to ask you about. What's the best way for a kid that maybe is, maybe just coming into his body, so forth and so on. But obviously, the camp is the camp circuit is definitely paramount. One more
And
question.
it's interesting too. One quick thing on that too is that because you said coming into their body too, it's also people like me, colleges as well. Like if you go to a camp early, like you're a freshman and you go to a camp, that doesn't. I think everybody understands that you're not a finished product. If you
Right.
go out there and you compete well and you show you got some building blocks, then when you come back in a year or two, there you can then say, oh yeah, he's grown a few inches, he's put on 20 pounds. Like people
Right.
understand that, so don't be afraid to go out there early and show what you got, and
Yeah.
then say you can build a body of work too. Don't be afraid of that. You don't have to wait to the very end to do it. You can
Yeah.
do it early and build up.
Yeah. That was one of the things I was just about to ask you is like, you know, h- how important is it to get it? And people don't understand the anxiety and the pressure it is to go to these camps. Whereas, like,
Yeah.
everything is dependent on a 40 broad jump, and they run these camps like a combine. I mean, it's like I've
Mhm.
been in the combine before, and it's they don't do bench press and everything like that, but you're probably doing vertical jump, hand size, and all. You're getting an
Yeah.
honest evaluation from a NFL type of standpoint. So it is a lot of anxiety. I always tell kids,
Mhm.
get on the camp circuit as early as possible. But with that, with the asterisk is make sure you're ready or as ready as you can be,
Yeah.
because if you and reason why, and correct me, I want you just your opinion on this. Get on it early with the understanding that you're going to do it again. You know what I mean? It's almost like
Yes.
taking the ACT. Like the first time, we're going to study for it, see what we were deficient in, come back, and then knock it out of the park. Because I think still coaches like to see improvement. You know that.
Yes.
But
Mhm.
then also, I think getting all the process, checking in, knowing where you're going, sizing up your opponent, seeing where you got to work at, and then going out and performing under the, I guess, bright lights of honest evaluations of the scouts in colleges. Because I always tell kids, these guys that aren't, let's say, on the field coaches and say they're analysts or support staff, they're trying to go and be a coach somewhere,
Right.
ideally, right? So if they
Mhm.
go somewhere and take their own staff, they're taking some of their notes with them, and you could go from fourth or fifth on the present list at the college to one or two at the next college.
Yeah, that's a great point, because what you because how much staff turnover there is, and that's not always a bad thing. It's like you said, it's a guy that could be moving up through the ranks that he came. Example of this, when I was in Detroit a few weeks ago at their Wayne State mega camp, and there were just a ton of colleges there. It felt like most of the Big Ten had representation at that camp, and then it like Division II, NAIA, all of them, right? And I met a guy, Phil Parker was there, the defensive
Yeah,
coordinator of
yeah,
Iowa, but then he also had like an assistant that was there,
yeah,
and that's a guy that, hey, in a couple years we look up, and he's a full-time assistant on a staff. So and if he just saw a freshman or a younger player at that camp, he goes back and looks at his notes and says, wherever he's at this time, hey, maybe I can go pluck this kid, or I need to
yeah,
find him and figure out what's going on with them. Yeah, you never know who's at those camps and where they're going to end up, which is why an important piece of advice I would always give too is don't ever go to any of those camps and like big time anybody, because you never know what that guy could turn into and end up being like either a head coach down the line or, a coordinator or anything like that. But yeah, your point is very good about being able to go and do these tests so that you have a point of comparison to say, hey, my freshman year, I ran, a 4.8 40, but by my junior year, I'm running a 4.65 because I actually know what I'm doing and I can get it going. And I could not advise more that don't ever go to one of these camps and have the first time that you're doing that event be that thing, right? So like practice it. You might not be able to go get the best speed training in the world, but you could go out there and line up and run a 40 in the backyard. You got to try something so that you have your wits about you when you're going to do that. But there's a lot that goes into that. And it's a great thing for kids to be able to go and get that exposure. But I totally understand why it's so anxiety filled for families and kids.
One more question before we let you go, Greg. Obviously, on the recruiting locally here in Nebraska, Millard South, it seems like when you look at it, they had a great team last year, and kind of just lost their way down the stretch. And I think the inexperience of some of their younger players, and they had a really good senior class, most likely, most of them on the defensive side. Now they've had that under their belt, maturity, and for whatever reasons, I don't know if a lot of kids have transferred there. A lot of Power 5 kids have transferred there. The roster is stacked. Really, to be honest with you, they perform like they are supposed to be on paper. You might see them, in my opinion, you might see them creep into the final top 25 in some people's list because, by my estimation, they have more than 20 guys that are going to go and play college football at some level. And I think they probably got close to eventually when it's all said and done. Now, granted, there's other factors, academics, off the field stuff, but just if you just take on paper, you're getting up there in the double digits of Power 5 guys on that roster. I wanted to ask you this because it's always interesting. What is it like? What are the advantages, the disadvantages, or how does the recruitment process change from your experience on a national level when you have a roster loaded like that? Because there's some players probably on West Side that probably didn't get as much, I guess, quote unquote, love or looks, even though you had 2 kids going to Notre Dame. You got Caleb Benning coming here and you had a plethora of other players going to college. There's probably 1 or 2 that slipped through the cracks, and you could also slip through a crack on a team or slip through the cracks on a team like Millard South, even though you're initially recruited by Power 5 because of, they're all going to this place or they're going here, or sometimes you might miss a guy. Talk about that, because I think it's going to be a very unique process for this coaching staff up there, the players, the parents, and the mentors and everybody else to deal with it. As much excitement, there's going to be a lot of pressure.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, what it'll be like kind of incumbent upon the coaching staff to make sure that, hey, when they come to see, Jet, or they come to see Chase Lofton, like we got to make sure that we're showing these coaches our other guys as well, right? Like we got to make sure that everyone's getting mentioned because there's going to be so many of them. And part of the issue, it's an interesting double-edged sword, because on one hand, you're going to have a ton of colleges coming in to like view your practices, and they're going to be watching your film. There'll probably be a coach, a head coach or a coordinator at a game for that team every single week during the football season. But part of what ends up happening sometimes is you get overlooked on a team like that because it's hard to tell if you're not standing out because you're not as good as those other guys, or because you just don't get the same opportunities, right? Sometimes it becomes more difficult to really stand out if you're on a loaded team like that. And that's part of the reason why sometimes you get those guys that slip through the cracks. And so it can be real difficult to stand out in those scenarios, even though on the front end that more coaches are going to be paying attention to your team because you have a bunch of guys on that roster. So you have to, as a player, have to be able to do what you can to make sure you're maximizing your opportunities, because people will understand that, hey, if you're a receiver on that team now, maybe you're not going to have like the gaudy stats anymore, But does that mean that if you go from, say, just an example, say 70 catches to 50, are your touchdowns still up, right? Like, are you still double-digit touchdowns in high school where you should be dominating most teams that you play, so you should be putting the ball in the end zone? Those sorts of things. Like, are you able to have tackles for losses? Are you forcing fumbles on defense when the ball actually comes your way? Are you picking passes off? Like, that sort of thing. Are you still making those plays? Because when you have a loaded team like that, it's really hard to stand out, but it is also good because you're going to get the attention.
Yeah, it's part of the process and the job that's going to keep you up just as much as you're trying to figure out how to get, some more points on the board or wins and losses because, just on the offensive end, you got 2 Power 5 receivers, you got 2 Power 5 tight ends. I think the offensive lineman, the left tackle, he's starting to pick up some Power 5 offers. Then you got the quarterback. And I'm sure they got guys on the defensive end as well. And I mean,
And then there's always somebody that comes out of nowhere that develops because we got kids in high school, right? So somebody's going, shoot up 3 inches and gain 20 pounds. And then all of a sudden we're like, oh, who's that kid?
Right. And then you had like a kid that's from Lincoln that's going up there at Dallas, Washington, who is kind of a, receiver DB. So they're going to have to, they're going to, and I want to ask this, they're going to have to do a good job of if you have a guy, particularly on offense, that has defensive capabilities, you're going to have to highlight them on both, and you're going to have to find a dude, and then you got to make sure that because I'm assuming they're going to blow a lot of teams out, you got to make sure that you don't have them out there feasting on a team when you're up by 35 points. You got to make sure that everything's on the up and up, and then you also have to make sure you're not coaching to get guys touches. You got to coach to win. You got to coach to score points, and then all that stuff should be, you can't really say, okay, well, I got to get Greg, a couple touches or routes. Well, then when people know you're doing that, then you're not going to be able to execute as well. So I think it's a very unique. I think this is new to Nebraska, to this magnitude. I think
you see it other places, but it is definitely new here. Yeah,
it's new to this magnitude so quick, right? Because it's just kind of just in this off season, and on top of it, they're playing in Arizona the first game, and I think they might be on ESPN too. So you go from a team that was, I guess, finished probably top 4, right? Lost in the semifinals, right? You didn't get to the lost to Elkhorn South. So you're going from like kind of a team that wasn't on the big stage. Now you're really going into the entertainment stage. I'm sure they from what I've seen, they've been working hard and all that other stuff, but being able to perform under those type of situations consistently for 12, 14 weeks, depending on how far you go in the playoffs, is going to be more of the interesting dynamic versus, they got Power 5 guys, because those guys are going to keep those offers anyway. So I appreciate you coming on, Greg, man, because obviously you're the national guy now with Rivals up there. And you left me here in Lincoln, but it's all good. We have to come out there and break bread. But we're going to try to get you on during the season every week, because I think with the way that hopefully Nebraska performs, I think the recruiting will perform as well. So it'll always be good to have the national guy on. Plus, I think it's always good to have somebody that has intimate knowledge from local knowledge and then national experience. But this is Foreman Friends, brought to you by the Mercado and Advanced Medical Imaging. We're going to take a quick break and come right back. What up? We're back. Jay Foreman, Harrison, old school. We got Dr. Razdan in here from Advanced Medical Imaging. We got he's doing the hardest thing of his day. He does surgeries and everything, and he's a doctor putting on these headphones. Here, let me get this one. There you go. Headphones. It's good to have him come in. Obviously, with the NBA Finals and Porzingis out. There you go.
Jay, it ain't working. Look at this. Oh, jeez. There you go. Right.
See there? It's customer service.
There
right?
You go.
You can clip that here. But with Porzingis, he originally had a calf injury or ankle injury calf. It's like now he has a unique injury according to him. But we're going to talk about hamstrings first.
Sure.
And I have experience with a hamstring pull. I always thought that, Doak Ostergaard was our trainer. He made me miss spring break once because I had we tested out for the pros. And I swear when I'd never pulled a hammy before. But when this bad boy twinged, I literally face planted and got turf burn on my face. But I always think it's very unique when I didn't know the difference because I only had one. when I got to the pros, I remember I had a older veteran that kind of would mentor me through it. And he's like, this is the one you want. This is the one you don't want. And it's high grade, which is, or high or low, which is high is like up towards your butt cheek and low is more towards your knee. And then they have a mid, right?
Yep.
Okay. So for our listeners out there, and since it's starting to become hot and humid, and if you don't hydrate and you try to run up a hill and try to go into second or third or fourth gear and that hammy starts to twinge, you're going to know which one. So when you call into the emergency room and say you need some help, you can say, I got low grade. Well, anyways, Doc, I want you to explain the difference between all three and which ones, like I texted you, which one do you not want, which is one that can linger or the one that you possibly could make, say I'm in a playoff game and we got a bye week and the one that could possibly answer the bell.
Well, I mean, I think the best way to look at it, there's two kind of classifications. One is whether it's high or whether it's low.
Right.
And then there's that, out of those classifications, then there's low grade, mid grade, and high grade, or grade 1, grade 2, grade 3.
Right.
The one that you don't want is the one that's up closer to the pelvis or the groin, where those muscles attach. And, the hamstrings are the flexors, right? They flex your knee, right? That's the thing. And where they attach up near the pelvis, if that gets torn or gets avulsed, that thing lingers. That thing lingers a long time. Now, and then when I told you about the low, mid, high, or low, mid, and severe, the low grade ones, you can get back. People rest those for 3 to 5 days and they get back to it. That's okay. But the high grade ones, that grade 3, those things can go, you need recovery at least 6 to 8 weeks or 8 to 12 weeks.
Right. Those are months.
Those are months. And, what's Tyrese? Tyrese came back for the Pacers. Didn't he have he had like a hamstring injury and they brought him back too quick.
Yeah.
And then he re-injured it right away.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he did.
And I think I think his was a grade 2. I don't remember exactly. And I think they brought him back too quick. But anyway, I mean, the one you don't want, I think we were talking about this earlier, the one up higher, closer to your pelvis.
Right.
And the other one you don't want is anywhere but totally avulsed one, right? Hamstrings are a series of 3 muscles. I'm not going to get too technical here, but where they attach, if they break off that attachment, it's called an avulsion.
Right.
That's surgery.
Right.
The rest of them are really, rehab, all that kind of stuff.
And it seemed, now granted, I think people probably didn't know back in the 70s if they had a avulsed hamstring or not, but I think it's more prevalent now.
It is because
am I right?
Yeah,
by the numbers.
What is that? 53 NFL teams in the league.
53? They've had hamstring surgeries.
There is. I think there was a crazy statistic I read. It was like 97% of those 53 teams have had at least one hamstring injury every year, and usually happens at practice. Of more than anything else, and most of the time it's wide receivers and defensive backs.
Right, and that's just because of. Is that an overwork injury, or is that a long speed, like where you gotta go, like where you gotta change from back pedal sprint, or I'm trying to run past the DB?
Combination of both, but most typically it's because they didn't stretch long enough. They didn't. And you'd be surprised. These are pro athletes, right? They should know, but it's most of the time, like you mentioned earlier, people are dehydrated. Maybe they didn't stretch long enough, and then they go quick bursts, quick burst speeds. Defensive backs, quick burst speeds. Wide receivers trying to accelerate too fast, and then snap. It can hurt.
You'll be surprised that. Now I was extremely blessed in Nebraska, where we, and in the pros for most part, that they always really took more time in group work, getting warmed up. You'll be surprised, especially at the pro level, that how quick they start practice.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. It's like, hey, coach is here. Let's hit it. We're right in the kickoff right that now. What is very important is how you prepare for practice, right? So they give you enough time to get taped, and then it's your job. Say practice starts at 3. Walk through. You better be out there at 2:45 if it takes you 15 minutes or however long to get whatever warm up or whatever you got. Because if you don't, I've seen guys, really, really hurt their career based on a hamstring injury. And this is another thing I want to ask you about is even when I hurt my hamstring in college, I felt it still the second, like a year later. I knew I was fine. how long does it generally take from, say, like a grade 3 hamstring, not off the bone, but say like
just
a
tear,
regular
tear. Yeah. Well, I will tell you at a minimum, we as IR guys, the ortho guys treat the really heavy stuff.
Right.
Us IR guys do those steroid injections for the one near the pelvis.
Right.
But from whatever I know from literature, at least a minimum of 8 weeks.
Right.
I think that's a very reasonable number to get yourself rested and rehabbed.
Right.
If you go, I mean, look, everybody's got deadlines. If people need this, and people need that. Yeah. So, but at least an 8 week number is a good number to believe in. And especially for younger athletes, if you don't rest it, you're going to injure other things, right? We talked about this. You'll injure other things. Yeah.
And talk about the one that's a little bit lower in the, like down here.
The knee. Yeah.
And what activities or what movements generally trigger those?
So, lateral movements, anterior movements, right? That's what, when people talk about hamstring injuries, the HSI injuries lead to more common ACL injuries, right? And one thing you got to be prepared for is your hamstring is like a protector for the knee, right? That's what it is. Your quads and your hamstring protect the knee. If you have weakness in a hamstring because you came back too quick from rehab, right? You're going to splint. You're going to try to protect your knee in other ways because your ACL is much more important, right? And people don't realize that when they try to modify their behavior, their mechanics, the neuromechanics, they're gonna tear that ACL.
Right.
And so, I would tell you that the low, like we said, proximal, those distal hamstring injuries, those affect mostly the knee more.
Knee.
Yeah.
And then, so what are I always say there's a byproduct of it, and I remember telling you one of the scariest moments when I was probably on like one of my last legs. I still had about a quarter tank left in the tank when I was a career, and I didn't know how I strained my calf. I woke up I practiced, right? To talk about this, I practiced, right, and it was hot like this, and I jumped in the cold tub, no big deal. And so then I woke up the next morning. I was like, whoa, did I pull something? I wore a calf sleeve. But then he had told me, he was like, you were weak in your hamstring and your quad. Mm-hmm. And I've been kind of fighting I wouldn't say a full strain, but it was kind of like, it was an imbalance, right? Talk about that and how it went down my leg, right?
Yeah. So it's like neuromechanics, right? Yeah. People alter their gait. People alter their mechanics of how they stand to protect from the injury, right? You get your injury, you're going to do everything you can to try to splint away from it. Right. I think